There's more wealth sitting on the ocean floor than in all the gold mines on Earth combined. And the race to claim it is about to get violent. In 2021, a Chinese research vessel was spotted in international waters off the coast of Hawaii. It was mapping the ocean floor, conducting surveys, taking samples. The US Navy was watching closely, but they couldn't do anything about it because these were international waters. Nobody owns them. And that's exactly the problem. Because lying on the ocean floor, thousands of feet below the surface, are deposits of minerals worth trillions of dollars. Cobalt, nickel, copper, manganese, rare earth, elements, everything we need for batteries, electronics, and renewable energy technology. Just sitting there, waiting to be harvested. Countries around the world are racing to stake claims, to develop the technology to mine in deep water, to secure the resources they need for the future. China is leading the race and has already invested billions. Russia is aggressively exploring. The United States is trying to catch up. European nations are forming alliances. Even landlocked countries are getting involved through international bodies. This isn't some future scenario. Deep-sea mining could begin within the next few years. And when it does, it's going to trigger a resource scramble unlike anything we've seen since the colonial era. Because the ocean floor is the last frontier, the last unexplored, unclaimed space on Earth. And whoever controls it controls the raw materials for 21st century technology. By the end of this video, you're going to understand what's down there, why it's so valuable, who's fighting for control, and what happens when nations start competing for resources in a space that technically belongs to no one. This is the new ocean floor gold rush, and it's going to reshape geopolitics for the next century. Let me start by explaining what we're actually talking about. The ocean floor isn't just sand and rock. In certain areas, particularly in the deep ocean between 4,000 and 6,000 meters deep, the floor is covered with polymetallic nodules. These are potato-sized rocks that formed over millions of years as minerals precipitated out of seawater. They contain high concentrations of manganese, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements, all metals that are critical for modern technology. A single square kilometer of ocean floor in the right location can contain more of these metals than major terrestrial mines. The biggest concentration is in an area called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. This is a vast region of the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and Mexico, about 4.5 million square kilometers. That's roughly the size of the continental United States, and it's covered in these nodules. Estimates suggest there are over 21 billion tons of nodules in this one area alone. To put that in perspective, that's more manganese than humanity has ever mined from land, more cobalt than exists in all known terrestrial reserves. It's an almost incomprehensible amount of resources. But it's not just nodules. There are also polymetallic sulfides around hydrothermal vents. These form where superheated water erupts from the ocean floor, depositing minerals as it cools. These deposits contain copper, zinc, gold, silver, and other valuable metals. And there are cobalt-rich crusts on seamounts and underwater mountains. These crusts can be meters thick and contain cobalt, nickel, platinum, and rare earth elements. All of this has been known for decades. We first discovered polymetallic nodules in the 1870s during early ocean exploration, but mining them seemed impossible and unnecessary. Why go through the enormous expense and technical challenge of mining thousands of meters underwater when there were plenty of terrestrial deposits? That calculation has changed. Terrestrial deposits are becoming harder to access. They're in deeper mines, lower grade, or often in politically unstable regions. Meanwhile, demand for these metals is exploding. Electric vehicles need cobalt and nickel for batteries. Renewable energy needs copper. Electronics need all of these metals, and countries are looking at ocean floor mining as a solution. The technology is now close to viable. Companies have developed remotely operated vehicles and autonomous robots that can collect nodules from the ocean floor. They're lifted to the surface through pipes, The process is still expensive and technically challenging, but it's becoming feasible. Several companies have conducted test operations. They've successfully collected nodules, brought them to the surface, and extracted metals. They claim they'll be ready for commercial operations within the next few years. And that's when things get complicated, because nobody owns the deep ocean. Coastal nations have exclusive economic zones extending to 100 nautical miles from their shores. Within those zones, they control resources. But beyond that is the high seas, international waters. According to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, these areas are the common heritage of mankind. That means they belong to everyone and no one. Resources extracted from international waters are supposed to benefit all humanity, not just whoever does the extracting. This is a beautiful principle, but it's completely impractical. When billions of dollars are at stake, the UN created an organization called the International Seabed Authority, or ISA, to regulate deep-sea mining in international waters. Countries and companies can apply to the ISA for exploration licenses. These give them the right to explore specific areas. As of now, the ISA has issued about 30 exploration licenses, mostly to countries or state-owned enterprises. China has 5 licenses covering different types of deposits in different locations. Russia has 3, France has 2, India has 2. The UK, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and others have 1 each. These licenses are for exploration only, not mining, but they're positioning for when commercial mining is approved. The ISA is supposed to develop a mining code, a set of regulations that govern how mining can happen, what environmental protections are required, how revenue is shared, who can mine where. But this process has been fraught with conflict, because the countries that have the technology and resources to mine want minimal restrictions. They want to be able to extract and profit. Meanwhile, countries that don't have mining capability, particularly small island nations and developing countries, want stronger regulations and greater revenue sharing. They argue that if these resources belong to all humanity, the profits should be distributed, not captured entirely by wealthy nations and corporations. Environmental organizations are pushing for even stronger protections, or a complete moratorium on deep-sea mining. They argue that we don't understand the deep ocean ecosystems well enough to know what damage mining will cause, and that damage could be irreversible. The ISA has been negotiating the mining code for years. Progress is slow because these interests are so divergent, but pressure is building. In 2021, the Pacific island nation of Nauru triggered a provision in the treaty that effectively forces the ISA to finalize regulations within 2 years. That deadline has passed and regulations still aren't finished, but mining could potentially proceed without them under existing framework rules. This has created enormous tension. Let me tell you about who the key players are. China is far ahead of everyone else. They've invested billions in deep-sea mining technology. They have multiple research vessels conducting surveys. They've developed specialized equipment for collecting nodules and extracting minerals. They have the largest number of exploration licenses, and Chinese companies are partnering with small Pacific island nations, offering development aid in exchange for sponsorship of mining applications. This is important because to get an ISA license, you need a state sponsor. Most sponsors are developed nations applying for themselves, but China is effectively buying sponsorship from small countries that need money and have no mining capability themselves. Nauru, the country that triggered the 2-year deadline, is sponsored by a Canadian company called the Metals Company. But the relationship between Nauru and the Metals Company raises questions. Nauru is one of the world's smallest countries. They have no deep-sea mining expertise, but they raise sponsoring a commercial mining application because the Metals Company is paying them and promising economic benefits. Critics argue this is a way for companies to bypass the spirit of international law. They ray using small nations as flags of convenience to access resources that are supposed to belong to all humanity. The Metals Company is run by a man named Gerard Barron. He's an entrepreneur who previously worked in tech and other industries. He's positioned the metals company as an environmental solution. He argues that terrestrial mining is incredibly destructive. Forests are cleared, mountains are leveled, communities are displaced. Deep-sea mining, he claims, is actually less damaging. You're collecting rocks from a barren ocean floor rather than destroying rainforests. It's a compelling argument, but marine scientists strongly dispute it. They argue the ocean floor isn't barren. It's home to unique ecosystems we barely understand, and the sediment plumes created by mining could spread hundreds of kilometers, devastating marine life. The metals company has conducted environmental impact assessments, but they're the ones paying for the assessments. Critics argue there's an obvious conflict of interest. Independent scientists who've looked at the data are much more skeptical about the environmental claims. Regardless, the metals company is pushing hard to begin operations. They've secured funding. They're building equipment. They're lobbying governments and the ESA. They want to be first because being first means capturing market share and setting precedents. Russia is also heavily invested. They have state-owned enterprises conducting exploration. Russia's strategy is about securing resources and establishing presence. They're not as far along technologically as China, but they're claiming territory and building capability. Russia sees deep-sea mining as strategically important for the same reason. They're aggressive about Arctic resources. Control over raw materials is power, and Russia wants to ensure they're not dependent on other countries for critical metals. Japan and South Korea are advanced technologically. They have developed sophisticated mining equipment, but they're being more cautious about pushing forward without international consensus. They're participating in the process but not leading the charge. Europe is divided. Some European countries have exploration licenses and are developing technology, but there's also strong environmental opposition within Europe. Many European environmental groups and some governments are calling for a moratorium on deep-sea mining until we understand the impacts better. The United States is in a strange position. The U.S. never ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. For complicated political reasons, the treaty was never approved by the Senate. This means the U.S. isn't technically part of the international framework governing ocean resources. But U.S. companies still want to participate in deep-sea mining, and the U.S. government recognizes that if they stay out, China and others will dominate. So there's been renewed push to ratify the treaty. But it's politically challenging. Some senators view any international treaty with suspicion. Meanwhile, U.S. companies are lobbying Congress for domestic legislation that would allow deep-sea mining under U.S. jurisdiction or through bilateral agreements. Defense hawks argue that dependence on China for critical minerals is a national security threat. They want domestic or allied sources of cobalt, nickel, and rare earths. Deep-sea mining could provide that, but environmental groups are opposing. It's a political fight playing out in Congress, with billions of dollars at stake. Now let's talk about the environmental concerns, because they're significant. The deep ocean is one of the least understood environments on Earth. We've explored less than 20% of the ocean floor. We know there's life down there, but we don't know how ecosystems function. What we do know is that deep ocean life is often extremely slow, growing and adapted to very specific conditions. Disturbance could take centuries to recover from, or might never recover. Deep-sea mining involves several activities that could be destructive. First, you're physically removing the nodules. These nodules provide habitat for organisms. Some creatures attach to them. Others live between them. Removing them eliminates that habitat. Second, the mining equipment creates sediment plumes. As the collector moves across the ocean floor, it kicks up sediment. This sediment can spread across vast areas, carried by ocean currents. It settles on other parts of the ocean floor, smothering organisms. It also makes the water cloudy, affecting organisms that depend on clear water. Third, there's the discharge pipe. The collected nodules are pumped to a surface ship along with water and sediment. Some of that water and sediment is discharged back into the ocean. Early plans called for discharging it at the surface, but this would create massive surface plumes that could affect marine life in the upper ocean, including fish and even whales. Now companies are talking about discharging at depth, but that still creates plumes, and we don't know how it affects mid-water ecosystems. Fourth, there's noise pollution. The mining equipment is loud. Sound travels well underwater. Marine mammals depend on sound for communication and navigation. Mining could interfere with this. Fifth, there's the possibility of chemical contamination. The equipment uses lubricants and hydraulic fluids. Accidents could release these into the ocean, and the processing of nodules on ships could create waste products that end up in the ocean. Scientists have conducted some studies on the impacts. In the 1980s, there was an experimental mining operation in the Pacific. Researchers have gone back to the site periodically to see if it recovered. 30 years later, the tracks from the mining equipment are still visible. There's been some recolonization, but the ecosystem hasn't fully recovered to its original state, and that was a small-scale test. Commercial mining would be orders of magnitude larger. There's also concern about losing biodiversity we haven't even discovered yet. Every deep-sea expedition discovers new species. The deep ocean is essentially an alien world. We have no idea what exists down there. If we start mining before we've even cataloged what's there, we could drive species extinct without ever knowing they existed. This bothers scientists. It also bothers people who think there could be practical value. Some deep-sea organisms have unique biochemistry adapted to extreme conditions. This can have applications in medicine or biotechnology. If we destroy them before discovering them, we lose the potential. But mining advocates argue we can't let environmental concerns stop all. Resource extraction. They point out that terrestrial mining is also environmentally destructive, and we still do it because we need the materials. They argue that with proper regulation, deep-sea mining can be done in a way that minimizes harm. They propose things like leaving some areas completely unmined as refuges, creating marine protected areas, monitoring impacts, and stopping if damage is too severe. In theory, this makes sense. In practice, it's hard to enforce, because mining is happening in international waters. Who's going to monitor compliance? Who's going to stop a country or company that violates rules? The ESA is supposed to do this, but they have limited enforcement capability. They can revoke licenses, but if a country decides they don't care and keeps mining anyway, what can the ESA do? Send warships? They don't have warships. Impose sanctions? They're not a government. This is the fundamental problem with regulating anything in international spaces. There's no world government with enforcement power. Everything depends on voluntary compliance and peer pressure. Now let's talk about the economics. Is deep-sea mining actually profitable? Right now, it's unclear. The costs are enormous. You need specialized ships, remotely operated vehicles, thousands of meters of pipe, processing facilities. The equipment operates in extreme conditions miles underwater. Maintenance is difficult and expensive, and you're in international waters, often far from ports. Logistics are challenging. All of this adds up to high capital costs and high operating costs. For mining to be profitable, metal prices need to be high enough to justify these costs. In recent years, cobalt and nickel prices have been high because of electric vehicle demand. At those prices, deep-sea mining starts to look viable. But commodity prices are volatile. If they drop, deep-sea mining becomes uneconomical. Companies are gambling that the long-term trend is upward. The demand for battery metals will keep increasing, and that terrestrial supply won't keep up. If that's true, deep-sea mining could be hugely profitable. Some analysts estimate that a commercial deep-sea mining operation could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue per year once fully operational, with profit margins potentially in the 30 to 40% range if metal prices are high. That's extremely attractive, but it requires massive upfront investment, billions of dollars to develop the technology and establish operations. Only large companies or state-backed enterprises can afford that. which is why most of the players are either state-owned companies or large corporations backed by significant investors. The metals company has a different model. They're a publicly traded company. They've raised money from investors by selling stock. They're using that money to develop mining capability. If they succeed, early investors could make huge returns. But it's high risk. If the technology doesn't work, or if regulations prevent mining, or if metal prices collapse, investors could lose everything. The stock price has been volatile, reflecting this uncertainty. There's also a geopolitical economic dimension. Countries that control access to critical minerals have leverage. Right now, China dominates the production of battery metals. They control cobalt refining, rare earth processing, lithium refining. This gives them enormous power over the global supply chain for electric vehicles and renewable energy. Western countries want to reduce this dependence. Deep-sea mining could provide an alternative source of materials. If the US, Europe, or allies control deep-sea mining, they're less dependent on China for critical minerals. China sees this too, which is why they're racing to establish dominance in deep-sea mining. If Chinese companies control the majority of ocean floor mining, they maintain their leverage over global supply chains. It's resource competition playing out in a new domain, similar to the competition for rare earth minerals or lithium, but on a potentially larger scale because the ocean floor resources are so vast. Let me tell you about some of the technology being developed, because it's genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. The mining vehicles have to operate at depths where the pressure is over 600 times atmospheric pressure at sea level. That's like having 400 elephants standing on every square meter. Equipment has to be incredibly robust, and it can't have humans on board. Everything is remote operated or autonomous. The vehicles look like massive industrial tractors. They have wide tracks to move across the ocean floor without sinking into sediment. They have collection systems that vacuum or rake up nodules. Some designs use rotating brushes. Others use hydraulic suction. The nodules are then transported to a riser pipe. This is a vertical pipe extending from the ocean floor to a surface ship. Pumps push the nodules and water mixture up the pipe to the surface on the ship. The nodules are separated from water and stored. The ship needs to have huge storage capacity because it might operate for weeks before returning to port. Some companies are developing autonomous mining vehicles. These would operate with minimal human oversight. They'd follow pre-programmed paths across the ocean floor, collecting nodules, avoiding obstacles, communicating with the surface ship about their status. This automation is necessary because human operation via remote control is difficult with a time lag from signal travel. Even though signals move at the speed of light, there's noticeable delay when controlling a robot thousands of meters underwater. Autonomous operation is more efficient. There's also work on processing the nodules at sea versus on land. Taking nodules to shore and processing them there is straightforward, but expensive. You have to transport massive weight. Some companies are exploring processing at sea, extracting the metals on the ship and disposing of waste material overboard. This reduces what you have to transport, but it is technically challenging and raises additional environmental concerns about what is being dumped back into the ocean. China has developed ships specifically designed for deep-sea mining. They have research vessels that can deploy and recover mining equipment. They have survey ships with advanced sonar to map the ocean floor. They're investing heavily because they see this as strategically critical. Russia and other nations are doing the same, but not at China's scale. Now let's talk about the legal complexity. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is the framework, but it was negotiated in the 1970s and 80s, before deep-sea mining was actually viable. So some of the provisions are vague, and different parties interpret them differently. For example, what does common heritage of mankind actually mean? Does it mean that anyone can mine as long as they share some revenue? Or does it mean that mining should only happen if it benefits everyone, and maybe shouldn't happen at all if it's harmful? Countries and companies interpret this very differently. Mining companies argue that they are allowed to mine in international waters, as long as they follow ESA regulations and pay fees. The fees would go to the ESA and be distributed to member states, with some priority for developing countries. This satisfies the common heritage principle. They claim. Environmental groups and some countries argue that common heritage means these resources shouldn't be exploited at all unless there is consensus that it is beneficial for humanity. And there's definitely no consensus. There are also questions about how much territory one entity can control. The exploration licenses cover large areas. Some licenses are for areas of thousands of square kilometers. If commercial mining is approved, how much of that area can actually be mined? Can one company or country effectively exclude others from entire regions? The ESA is supposed to address this in the mining code, but countries disagree. China and others with multiple licenses want to be able to mine extensively in their licensed areas. Smaller countries and environmental groups want limits to prevent monopolization. There's also the question of military involvement. If countries are competing for resources in international waters, do navies get involved? China's navy has been increasingly active in the Pacific. Some of their research vessels are accompanied by naval ships. This could be for protection or for asserting presence. The U.S. has freedom of navigation operations in the Pacific, partly to counter Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea. Could similar tensions emerge around deep-sea mining areas? If a Chinese mining ship is operating in international waters and the U.S. believes they are violating environmental regulations, what happens? Does the U.S. Navy intervene, or does it turn into a diplomatic incident? These scenarios haven't been tested yet, but they could become real as mining begins. Let me tell you about indigenous and Pacific Island perspectives. Many Pacific Island nations are concerned about deep-sea mining. Their economies depend on healthy oceans, fishing, tourism. Their cultures are deeply connected to the sea. They're worried that mining will damage ecosystems and affect fish populations. This would devastate their economies and way of life. Many Pacific Island leaders have called for a moratorium on deep-sea mining. Fiji, Samoa, and Palau are among those opposing mining unless environmental safety can be guaranteed. But some Pacific nations, like Nauru and Kiribati, are supporting mining, partly because they need revenue and mining companies are offering money, and partly because they're desperate. These are small, poor nations. Climate change is already affecting them. Rising sea levels threaten their existence. They need development funding. If mining companies offer them millions of dollars, they're tempted to take it, even if it means environmental risks. It's a difficult ethical position. Can we blame a tiny nation fighting for survival for taking money from mining companies? Or should we hold them to standards that wealthier nations don't always meet? Indigenous groups, particularly those with cultural connections to the ocean, are also speaking out. Many Pacific indigenous cultures view the ocean as sacred. They have traditional knowledge about marine ecosystems passed down for generations. They argue that industrial mining is incompatible with the spiritual and practical relationship they have with the sea. But their voices are often marginalized in international negotiations dominated by governments and corporations. Now let's talk about what happens if mining begins. Best case scenario. It's carefully regulated. Environmental monitoring is robust. If damage exceeds acceptable levels, operations are modified or stopped. Revenue is shared fairly. The metals extracted help with the transition to renewable energy and reduce dependence on more destructive terrestrial mining. Worst case scenario. It's a free-for-all. Multiple countries and companies start mining with minimal oversight. Vast areas of ocean floor are disturbed. Ecosystems are damaged or destroyed. Revenue goes primarily to wealthy nations and corporations. Environmental regulations are ignored because there's no effective enforcement. This triggers diplomatic conflicts as countries accuse each other of violations, potentially even military incidents. The most likely scenario is somewhere in between. Mining begins in a limited way. Some companies start operations in areas where they have licenses. There's international criticism, but not enough to stop it. Environmental impacts become apparent but are disputed. Some damage occurs, but it's hard to assess the full extent. Revenue flows primarily to mining companies, with some fees going to the ESA. There's continued debate about expanding mining or implementing stricter controls. Meanwhile, technology improves and costs decrease, making mining more attractive. More companies enter the market, the scale expands over years or decades. Significant portions of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone and other areas are mined. The ocean floor in these regions is fundamentally altered. Some species are lost, ecosystem functions change, but humanity gains access to massive quantities of metals that enable continued technological development. Future generations look back and debate whether it was worth it, similar to how we now debate whether the environmental destruction caused by the Industrial Revolution was justified by the prosperity it created. Let me talk about alternatives. Do we actually need deep-sea mining? Or are there other ways to meet demand for critical minerals? One alternative is improving recycling. Most electronics end up in landfills. The metals in them are lost. If we had better recycling infrastructure and processes, we could recover significant amounts of cobalt, nickel, copper, and other metals from waste electronics. Some estimates suggest recycling could meet a substantial portion of future demand, if done efficiently. But building recycling infrastructure requires investment, and it's not as profitable as mining virgin materials when commodity prices are high. Another alternative is reducing consumption. Do we really need to replace smartphones every 2 years? Do we need massive electric SUVs? Or could we use smaller vehicles and batteries? Could we design products to last longer and be more repairable? This would reduce demand for metals, but it goes against current economic models based on consumption growth. Companies want to sell more products, not fewer. Governments want economic growth measured by GDP, which increases with more consumption. So systemic change toward reduced consumption is difficult politically and economically. There's also substitution. Can we develop technologies that don't require these specific metals? Battery chemistry research is exploring alternatives to cobalt. Some new designs use more nickel or different materials entirely. If we could eliminate cobalt from batteries, demand would drop substantially. Similarly, research into alternative electronics could reduce dependence on other critical minerals. But this requires significant R&D investment and time, and there's no guarantee of success. Improving terrestrial mining practices is another option. Instead of destroying ecosystems, could we mine more carefully, with better environmental protections, remediating damage afterward? This would make terrestrial mining more expensive, but it might be comparable to the cost of deep-sea mining, and it would be on land where we can monitor and enforce regulations more easily than in the middle of the ocean. Some countries are implementing stricter mining regulations, but others compete by having looser standards. It's a race to the bottom that benefits mining companies at the expense of environments and communities. The fundamental question is whether deep-sea mining is necessary or just convenient. Necessary because we have no other options to meet demand, or convenient because it allows continued growth and consumption without difficult changes to how we produce and consume. If it's necessary, then we need to do it as carefully as possible, with strong regulations, environmental monitoring, revenue sharing, and willingness to stop if damage is too severe. If it's convenient, then maybe we should focus on alternatives, recycling, reduced consumption, different technologies, better terrestrial mining. These are harder paths, politically and economically, but they might be better long-term. So here's where we are. The ocean floor contains resources worth trillions of dollars, resources that are increasingly critical for modern technology. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, electronics, all depend on metals like cobalt, nickel, and copper. Countries and companies are racing to establish control over ocean floor deposits before anyone else does. China is ahead. Russia is aggressive. Western nations are trying to catch up. Pacific Island nations are caught between economic need and environmental concern. The technology to mine exists. Companies claim they'll begin operations soon, but there's no consensus on whether this should happen. Environmental scientists warn of catastrophic and irreversible damage to ecosystems we barely understand. Mining advocates argue it's less destructive than terrestrial mining and necessary for the energy transition. Indigenous communities and many Pacific nations want a moratorium. Mining companies and some governments want to proceed with minimal regulation. What happens next will set precedents for resource extraction in international spaces. If deep-sea mining proceeds without strong oversight, it could be environmental and political disaster. Species could be driven extinct before we discover them. Ecosystems could collapse. Conflicts could emerge over who controls what if proper regulations are implemented and enforced. Mining might happen in a controlled way that balances resource needs with environmental protection, but that requires unprecedented international cooperation. Countries and corporations putting long-term collective interests ahead of short-term competitive advantage. History suggests this is unlikely. The pattern has always been that resources get exploited until they're depleted or until damage becomes undeniable. Then belatedly, we try to fix it. The ocean floor might follow the same pattern. A rush to extract wealth, environmental damage that becomes apparent too late, attempts at regulation and restoration that are too little too late. Or maybe this time we'll learn from history. Maybe we'll develop strong international frameworks before the damage is done. Maybe we'll balance resource needs with environmental protection. Maybe we'll ensure benefits are shared rather than captured by a few. That would be unprecedented. But so is the challenge we face. The ocean floor is the last frontier on Earth. How we handle it will say a lot about humanity's ability to cooperate and make long-term decisions. Right now, the signs are encouraging, but the battle isn't over. And what happens in the next few years will determine whether the ocean floor becomes a shared resource managed for the benefit of all, or another arena for competition, exploitation, and environmental destruction. The choice is being made right now by governments, companies, and international bodies. Most people don't even know this is happening, but it's going to affect everyone. Because whether we get the minerals we need for clean energy transition, whether we protect irreplaceable ecosystems, whether we establish precedents for international cooperation or conflict, all of this depends on how we handle the hidden treasures of the ocean floor. Next, we reveal the resource war that could trigger the next global conflict.